The sun was just starting to peek through the tall windows of Buckingham Palace when James Whitmore put on his red uniform for what he thought would be another normal day. He had been doing the same routine for 15 years, polishing his boots until they shined like mirrors, straightening his tall black hat, and checking that every button was perfectly in place. James took pride in his work. Being a royal guard wasn't just a job for him, it was an honor that he never took lightly. At exactly 6:30 in the morning, James walked through the palace corridors toward his post. The ancient walls had seen centuries of history, and he felt that weight every single day. Other staff members nodded respectfully as he passed. Everyone knew James as the guard who never called in sick, never complained, and always went above and beyond his duties. The cleaning staff would often find small notes from him, thanking them for keeping the areas around his post spotless. The kitchen workers knew he would politely refuse any special treatment, always insisting he was just doing his job. But this morning felt different somehow. James couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As he reached his usual position, outside the state dining room, he noticed two men in dark suits standing near the main staircase. They weren't palace security, he knew every face in the building. These men had the look of serious government officials, the kind who only showed up when something important was happening. James tried to focus on his duties, standing perfectly, still as tourists and official visitors walked past throughout the morning. His job required him to be like a statue, alert but motionless, aware but silent. Children would often try to make him smile or move, but James had mastered the art of staying completely still while keeping his eyes sharp for any real threats. It was a skill that had taken years to perfect. Around 10:30, James noticed more unusual activity. Palace administrators were walking quickly through the halls, speaking in hushed tones. Something was definitely happening, but palace protocol meant that guards weren't told about most internal matters unless it directly affected their security duties. James had learned long ago not to ask questions about things that weren't his business. Then, at exactly 11:15, his world completely fell apart. Two palace security officers approached his post, along with those same dark-suited men he had noticed earlier. James felt his stomach drop as they walked directly toward him. The head of palace security, a man James had worked with for over a decade, looked genuinely troubled as he spoke. "James, we need you to come with us immediately," the security chief said, his voice unusually formal. "Please remove your weapon and hand over your keys." James felt confused and scared, but he followed orders. He had always followed orders. As he handed over his ceremonial sword and the keys to various palace doors, his mind raced, trying to understand what was happening. Had he done something wrong? Had there been a security breach in his area? The walk through the palace corridors felt like the longest journey of his life. Staff members stopped their work to stare as the small group passed by. James could see the shock and confusion on their faces. Some of the newer employees looked frightened, while the longtime staff members seemed genuinely worried about him. Mrs. Betty, who had been cleaning the palace for 30 years, actually gasped when she saw him being escorted away. They led him to a small office he had never been in before. The room was plain and cold, with just a table and a few chairs. Nothing like the grand rooms he was used to seeing every day. One of the dark-suited men introduced himself as Detective Inspector Crawford, while the other remained silent, taking notes on everything that was said. "James, we found some documents in your personal quarters this morning," Detective Crawford said, her voice serious but not unkind. "These are classified royal correspondence that should never have left secure areas of the palace." James felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "I don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What documents? I would never take anything from the palace." The detective placed several official-looking papers on the table. James could see the royal seal and confidential markings clearly. His hands started shaking as he realized how serious this was. These weren't just any papers. They were the kind of documents that could contain state secrets. "These were found hidden in your wardrobe this morning during a routine security inspection." The detective continued. "Can you explain how they got there?" James stared at the papers in complete shock. He had never seen them before in his life. His small quarters in the palace staff housing were always kept neat and organized. He would have noticed if anything unusual had been placed there. But here was proof, sitting right in front of him, that somehow these classified documents had been in his possession. "I swear on my mother's grave I have never seen these papers before," James said, his voice getting stronger as the initial shock wore off. "Someone must have put them there. I would never, ever, betray the trust that has been placed in me." But even as he said the words, James could see the doubt in everyone's eyes. The evidence was right there on the table. The documents had been found in his private space. To everyone else in the room, it looked like he had been caught red-handed, stealing royal secrets. The next few hours passed in a blur of questions, procedures, and paperwork. James answered every question honestly, explaining his daily routines, his access to different areas of the palace, and his complete loyalty to the crown. He offered to take any test they wanted, lie detector, background check, anything that might prove his innocence. But the damage was done. By afternoon, word had spread throughout the palace that James Whitmore, the guard everyone trusted and respected, had been arrested for stealing classified documents. The same corridors where he had walked with pride for 15 years now felt like a courthouse, where he had already been found guilty. The worst part was knowing that King Charles himself had been informed of the situation. James had always felt honored to serve the king, even though their interactions had been limited to formal occasions. Now he imagined the disappointment and anger the king must be feeling, believing that someone he had trusted had betrayed that trust. As James was led away from the palace in handcuffs, he caught a glimpse of some of his fellow guards watching, from a window. The look on their faces was a mixture of shock, disbelief, and something that hurt even more: doubt. These were men he had worked alongside for years, men who knew his character better than anyone. But even they seemed to be questioning whether they had really known him at all. The last thing James saw as the police car pulled away was the palace where he had spent the happiest and most meaningful years of his life. The building that had been his home, his purpose, and his pride was now a place where he was no longer welcome. In just a few hours, his entire world had crumbled around him, and he had no idea how to prove that he was innocent of crimes he would never even think of committing. As the car drove through the palace gates for what might be the last time, James closed his eyes and tried to understand how his perfect life had become a perfect nightmare. Somewhere in that palace, the real truth was waiting to be discovered. But for now, he was just a man whose loyalty had been questioned and whose future looked very dark indeed. The news of James Whitmore's arrest spread through Buckingham Palace like wildfire. By evening, every single person who worked in the building had heard about it. The shock was written on everyone's faces because James wasn't just any guard. He was the guard that everyone looked up to. In the staff dining hall, conversations were happening in whispers. People couldn't believe what they were hearing. James had been the kind of person who would return a penny if he found it on the floor, always making sure it got back to whoever might have dropped it. The idea that he would steal important royal documents seemed impossible to anyone who really knew him. Tom Bradley, who had worked as a groundskeeper for 20 years, shook his head as he spoke to a group of other staff members. "I've seen that man find lost jewelry from tourists and spend his entire break trying to track down the owners," he said. "Last month he found a lady's wedding ring in the garden and walked around for 2 hours until he found her. Does that sound like someone who would steal from the royal family?" The younger staff members were especially confused. James had been like a mentor to many of them when they first started working at the palace. He would quietly help new guards learn the complicated protocols, never making them feel stupid for asking questions. When nervous new employees made mistakes, James would cover for them and then gently explain how to do things correctly. Even the palace cats seemed to miss him. James had a soft spot for the several cats that lived around the palace grounds. Every morning he would bring small pieces of fish from his breakfast to feed them. The cats would wait by his usual post, looking confused when he didn't show up. It was a small detail, but it showed the kind of man James really was, someone who cared about every living thing around him. The other guards were having the hardest time accepting what had happened. They knew James better than anyone, During their long shifts together, they had shared stories about their families, their dreams, and their dedication to protecting the royal family. James had always been the one encouraging others to be their best, reminding them that they weren't just guards, they were guardians of something much bigger than themselves. Robert Chen, who had been James's partner on many shifts, couldn't stop thinking about all the times James had gone above and beyond his duties. There was the time when a tourist had a heart attack near the palace, and James immediately called for medical help while performing first aid until the ambulance arrived. He had saved a man's life, but he never talked about it afterward. He said he was just doing what anyone would do. Then there was the incident 2 years ago when James noticed something suspicious about a delivery truck. His careful observation and quick thinking had prevented what turned out to be a serious security threat. The palace security team had praised him privately, but James never mentioned it to his fellow guards. He wasn't the type to brag about his achievements. The palace administrative staff were equally shocked. James had always been professional and respectful in all his interactions with them. When there were special events at the palace, James would often volunteer to work extra shifts, never complaining about the long hours or the additional responsibilities. He understood that big events meant more security was needed, and he was always willing to help. Mrs. Patricia Wilson, who managed the staff schedules, remembered countless times when James had covered shifts for guards who were sick or dealing with family emergencies. He never asked for anything in return and never made a big deal about the favors he was doing for his colleagues. That man has worked Christmas Day for the past 5 years so that guards with young children could be home with their families, she told anyone who would listen. The cleaning staff had their own stories about James's character. Unlike some of the palace employees who barely noticed the people who cleaned around them, James always acknowledged the cleaning crew with genuine respect. He would move out of their way when they needed to clean his area, and he always said, "Thank you." During the winter months, he would bring them hot tea when they were working in the cold corridors. But despite all these testimonies to his character, the evidence against James seemed overwhelming. The documents found in his room were definitely real, and they definitely contained sensitive information about royal activities. The police had confirmed that these papers should never have left the secure areas of the palace. To most people looking at the situation from the outside, it seemed like James had been living a double life. The media was starting to pay attention to the story, though the palace was trying to keep details private. Reporters were asking questions about palace security and how someone with such a clean record could have been involved in such a serious breach. The few details that had leaked painted James as either a master manipulator who had fooled everyone for years, or as someone who had recently turned against the institution he had served so faithfully. Some of the newer guards started to question their own judgment. If they could be so wrong about James, who else might they be wrong about? The atmosphere in the palace became tense and suspicious. Guards who had previously trusted each other completely now found themselves wondering if their colleagues might also be hiding secrets. The most painful part for James's supporters was that they couldn't do anything to help him. Palace protocol meant that staff members weren't supposed to discuss ongoing investigations, even among themselves. They couldn't publicly defend him or share the stories they knew about his character. All they could do was hope that somehow the truth would come out. Back in his cell, James was struggling to understand how his life had changed so dramatically. He kept thinking about his 15-year service record, trying to remember any moment when he might have unknowingly done something wrong. But no matter how hard he searched his memory, he couldn't find anything that would explain how those documents had ended up in his possession. The hardest part was knowing that people he cared about were questioning everything they thought they knew about him. James had always valued the relationships he had built at the palace. The respect and trust of his colleagues meant more to him than any salary or benefits. Now all of that was gone, destroyed by evidence that he couldn't explain and couldn't deny. As he lay in his cell that first night, James thought about the oath he had taken when he first became a royal guard. He had promised to protect and serve the crown with honor, loyalty, and integrity. That promise had guided every decision he had made for 15 years. Even now, facing the worst crisis of his life, James still felt that same commitment. He just couldn't understand how everything had gone so terribly wrong. The saddest part was that the palace James loved was continuing without him. The tourists still came to see the changing of the guard, the official events still happened on schedule, and life went on as if he had never been there at all. But for the people who really knew James Whitmore, nothing felt the same. They had lost more than just a colleague. They had lost faith in their ability to judge character and trust the people around them. King Charles III was having his morning tea when the news reached him. His private secretary knocked on the door of his study with an expression that immediately told the king something serious had happened. Charles had been monarch for just over a year, and he was still getting used to the weight of responsibility that came with the crown. Every decision he made seemed to carry consequences that reached far beyond what he had expected. "Your Majesty, we have a situation that requires your immediate attention," his secretary said, placing a folder on the ornate desk. "One of the royal guards has been arrested for stealing classified documents." Charles felt his stomach drop as he opened the folder and saw James Whitmore's photograph clipped to his service record. He recognized the face immediately. James had been on duty during several important ceremonies since Charles had become king. The man had always appeared professional and dedicated, standing perfectly still for hours without showing any sign of discomfort or distraction. As Charles read through the details of what had been found in James's quarters, his initial shock quickly turned to anger. These weren't just any documents. They included correspondence about royal family movements, security procedures, and private communications that could be dangerous in the wrong hands. The thought that someone he had trusted with his family's safety had betrayed that trust made his hands shake with rage. "How long has this man had access to these areas?" Charles asked, his voice tight with controlled fury. 15 years, Your Majesty. His record has been spotless until now. That's what makes this so shocking." Charles stood up and walked to the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens. The idea that for 15 years someone with criminal intentions had been standing guard over his family was almost too much to bear. How many times had this man been present during private family moments? How many secrets had he been exposed to during his years of service? "I want him prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law," Charles said firmly. "If we show any mercy in a case like this, it will send the wrong message to everyone who works here. The crown must be above reproach, and anyone who betrays our trust must face serious consequences." His legal advisors were summoned immediately. Charles wanted to understand exactly what charges could be brought against James and what the maximum penalties might be. As they explained the various laws about treason, theft of state secrets, and breach of trust, Charles's determination only grew stronger. This wasn't just about punishing one person. It was about protecting the entire institution of the monarchy. "I don't care about his previous service record," Charles told the assembled advisors. "I don't care about any personal circumstances he might claim as excuses. The evidence is clear, and justice must be served. We cannot allow sentiment to interfere with what needs to be done." The king's private secretary tried to suggest that they might want to investigate further before making any public statements. But Charles was having none of it. In his mind, the case was already closed. The documents had been found in James's possession, and that was all the proof he needed. Any delay in prosecution would only make the monarchy look weak and indecisive. Charles called for a meeting with the head of palace security to discuss how such a breach could have happened. He wanted to know if there were other guards who might pose similar risks. The security chief assured him that all palace employees underwent thorough background checks, but Charles was no longer confident in those procedures. "Obviously, our screening process isn't good enough if someone like this can fool us for 15 years, Charles said sharply. "I want every single person who has access to sensitive areas reinvestigated immediately. We cannot afford to have any more surprises." The media was starting to ask questions, and Charles knew that how he handled this situation would be closely watched. He had spent his entire life preparing to be king, but nothing had really prepared him for making decisions that could destroy someone's life. Still, he believed that strong leadership sometimes required making difficult choices. During a private dinner that evening, Charles discussed the situation with his close family members. He expressed his disappointment and anger about the betrayal, and his determination to see justice done. "We trusted this man to protect us, and he used that trust to steal from us," he said. "I will not let this slide just because he wore our uniform for a long time." Some family members suggested that there might be more to the story, but Charles felt that such thinking was naive. The evidence was clear, and making excuses for criminal behavior would only encourage others to think they could get away with similar crimes. He had to think about the bigger picture, protecting the monarchy and maintaining public trust in the institution. Charles also worried about how this incident might affect the other royal guards. If one of their most respected members could be a criminal, how could anyone trust the others? He decided that not only did James need to be prosecuted, but the entire guard system needed to be reviewed and possibly restructured. The king's anger wasn't just about the stolen documents. It was about feeling fooled and vulnerable. As someone who had grown up in the public eye, Charles was used to being careful about who he trusted. The idea that he had been wrong about someone so completely made him question his own judgment about people. Late that night, Charles sat in his private study reviewing security protocols and thinking about all the times James had been present during sensitive family events. Had the man been taking mental notes about everything he saw and heard? Had he been planning this betrayal for years, or was it a recent decision driven by money or some other motivation? The more Charles thought about it, the angrier he became. He felt personally violated by what had happened. This wasn't just a crime against the state, it was a crime against his family, against everything they represented. James had been trusted with their most intimate moments, and he had used that trust to betray them. Charles made several phone calls to ensure that the prosecution would be handled by the most experienced lawyers available. He wanted this case to be airtight, with no possibility of James escaping justice on a technicality. Every piece of evidence needed to be preserved and presented perfectly. "I want everyone to understand that this kind of betrayal will not be tolerated," Charles told his chief of staff. "Whether someone has worked here for 15 days or 15 years makes no difference. Criminal behavior is criminal behavior, and we will respond accordingly." The king also began thinking about how to address this situation publicly. He knew that eventually he would need to make some kind of statement about what had happened. The public needed to know that the monarchy was strong enough to deal with internal threats, and that no one was above the law, regardless of their position or service record. As Charles prepared for bed that night, he felt satisfied that he was handling the situation correctly. He was showing the strong leadership that the country expected from their king. There would be no weakness, no second-guessing, and no mercy for someone who had betrayed the trust of the crown. Justice would be served, and everyone would know that King Charles III would not tolerate any threats to his family or his kingdom. Detective Inspector Claire Davidson had been investigating crimes for over 20 years, and something about the James Whitmore case was bothering her from the very beginning. On paper, everything looked straightforward. Stolen documents found in the suspect's room, clear evidence of wrongdoing, and a confession that he couldn't explain how the papers got there. But Davidson had learned to trust her instincts, and her instincts were telling her to look deeper. The first thing that struck her as odd was James himself. In her experience, people who committed serious crimes usually showed certain behaviors. When they were caught, they might be defensive, angry, or try to make deals. James Whitmore seemed genuinely confused and devastated, like someone whose entire world had just collapsed around him. His reactions felt real in a way that was hard to fake. Davidson decided to examine the evidence more carefully than anyone had expected. She started with the documents themselves, studying not just what they contained, but how they had been handled. The papers were definitely genuine royal correspondence, but something about their condition seemed strange. They looked too clean, too perfectly preserved for documents that had supposedly been stolen and hidden away. When she examined James's quarters more thoroughly, other details began to stand out. The man lived like a monk. Everything was perfectly organized and spotlessly clean. His personal belongings were minimal and carefully arranged. There were photos of his family, a few books about British history, and uniforms that were maintained with military precision. It didn't look like the room of someone who was living a secret life. The forensics team found something interesting when they tested the documents for fingerprints. While James's prints were indeed on some of the papers, they were only on the edges and corners, exactly where someone would touch them if they were examining documents they had never seen before. There were no prints in the places where someone would grip papers while secretly reading or copying them. Davidson interviewed James several times, asking him to walk through his daily routines in detail. His schedules were incredibly predictable. He worked his shifts, ate his meals at the same times every day, and spent his free time reading or maintaining his equipment. He had very few friends outside of work and almost never left the palace grounds except for official duties or family visits. "Tell me about your finances," Davidson asked during one interview. "Are you having any money problems?" James looked, confused by the question. "I save most of my salary," he said. "I don't have expensive hobbies or debt. My biggest purchase this year was new boots for work." Davidson checked his bank records and found exactly what he had described. James lived well below his means, saved regularly, and had no suspicious transactions. There were no large deposits that might suggest he was being paid for stolen information, and no unusual expenses that might indicate a gambling problem or drug habit. The more Davidson learned about James, the less sense the crime made. Most people who steal classified documents do it for money, revenge, or ideology. James didn't seem to have financial motivations. No one could think of any reason he might want revenge against the royal family, and his political views were boringly mainstream. He genuinely seemed to love his job and respect the monarchy. Davidson decided to examine the timeline more carefully. The documents that had been found in James's room were dated from different time periods over the past 6 months. If James had been stealing them gradually, there should be some pattern to when he had access to each specific document. But when she traced his work schedules and security clearances, several of the documents had been in areas where James had never been assigned. This discovery led Davidson to request all the security footage from the palace for the past week. She spent hours watching boring hallway cameras, looking for anything unusual. Most of what she saw was exactly what you would expect. Staff members going about their daily routines, guards changing shifts, and the regular flow of palace life. But then she found something interesting. The night before the documents were discovered in James's room, the security camera covering the staff quarters had malfunctioned for exactly 47 minutes. The timestamp showed the interruption clearly, but there was no record of any maintenance or technical issues that would explain the outage. Davidson brought in a technical expert to examine the camera system. What they found was disturbing. The camera hadn't malfunctioned naturally. Someone with knowledge of the security system had deliberately disabled it for that specific time period. The sabotage was sophisticated, done by someone who understood exactly how the palace surveillance worked. This wasn't random, the technical expert explained. Whoever did this knew exactly which camera to target and how to disable it without triggering any alarms. They also knew how to restore it afterward without leaving obvious traces. Davidson felt her investigation shifting into a completely different direction. Instead of looking at James as a criminal, she began to see him as a victim. Someone had deliberately chosen him as a target, and they had been clever about how they did it. But who had access to both the classified documents and the palace security system? She began interviewing other palace staff members, not about James, but about anything unusual they might have noticed in recent weeks. Most people hadn't seen anything strange, but a few mentioned small details that individually seemed unimportant, but together began to form a pattern. One of the cleaning staff mentioned that she had seen someone in the administrative areas late at night, when most people should have been gone. A kitchen worker remembered that someone had asked unusual questions about the guards' schedules. A maintenance worker recalled being asked to make copies of keys that seemed like odd requests at the time. None of these incidents had seemed significant when they happened, but Davidson was trained to see patterns that others might miss. Someone had been gathering information about palace operations, learning about security procedures, and positioning themselves to frame James for their own crimes. The most telling piece of evidence came when Davidson examined the personnel files of everyone who had access to the classified documents. She was looking for anyone who might have financial problems, personal issues, or other motivations for criminal behavior. What she found was surprising. There were several people who had much better access to sensitive information than James ever did. Davidson realized that whoever had framed James had been very smart about their choice of victim. James was a perfect scapegoat because he was respected but not particularly powerful. If something went wrong with his story, he wouldn't have influential friends to defend him. He was also someone whose simple lifestyle and honest nature would make him seem naive enough to get caught with stolen documents. As Davidson continued her investigation, she began to feel the pressure from higher authorities to wrap up the case quickly. The palace wanted this scandal to go away, and everyone seemed satisfied that they had caught the criminal. But Davidson knew that if she was right about James being innocent, then the real criminal was still out there, still stealing secrets, and probably feeling very confident that their plan had worked perfectly. She decided to dig deeper, even though she knew it might not make her popular with her supervisors. Somewhere in the palace, someone was laughing about how clever they had been. Davidson was determined to find out who that person was and make sure they didn't get away with destroying an innocent man's life. Detective Davidson's breakthrough came from an unexpected source: the palace's computer system. While reviewing digital security logs, she discovered something that made her heart race. Someone had been accessing classified files electronically, downloading them to encrypted devices and then printing them in secure areas where the activity wouldn't be easily traced. The digital footprints were subtle but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. Someone with high-level access credentials had been systematically copying royal correspondence for months. They had been careful to cover their tracks, but computer systems never forget completely. Every login, every file access, and every print job left tiny traces that expert analysts could follow. Davidson called in the palace's top cybersecurity specialist, a quiet man named Dr. Richard Hayes, who had been protecting royal digital communications for over a decade. When she showed him what she had found, his face went pale with recognition and concern. "This is much worse than we thought," Dr. Hayes said, pointing at the screen full of access logs. "Whoever did this had access to some of our most sensitive systems. They weren't just stealing random documents. They were targeting specific types of information that would be valuable to foreign intelligence services." The pattern of stolen information was very telling. The thief had focused on documents related to royal family travel plans, security procedures, diplomatic communications, and private correspondence with government officials. This wasn't the work of someone looking to sell gossip to tabloid newspapers. This was serious espionage. Dr. Hayes was able to trace the unauthorized access to a specific computer terminal in the palace administrative offices. The terminal was used by several high-ranking staff members, but the timing of the illegal downloads narrowed down the list of possible suspects dramatically. Only 3 people had been logged into that computer during the time periods when the thefts occurred. Davidson felt her investigation taking on a much more serious tone. She wasn't just trying to prove James's innocence anymore. She was hunting for a spy who had been operating inside Buckingham Palace for months. The stakes were much higher than anyone had realized, and the real criminal was far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The detective began surveillance on the 3 suspects without letting them know they were being watched. She studied their behavior patterns, their financial records, and their personal relationships. What she discovered about one of them made her stomach turn with anger and disgust. Lord Timothy Ashworth, the king's trusted private secretary, was living far beyond his means. While his official salary was substantial, his lifestyle suggested access to much more money than he should have had. He drove an expensive car, wore designer clothes, and had recently purchased a vacation home that cost more than he could afford on his palace income. When Davidson dug deeper into Ashworth's finances, she found a web of debt, secret accounts, and suspicious transactions that painted a picture of a man in serious financial trouble. He had gambling debts that he had hidden from everyone, including his wife. He owed money to several private lenders who weren't the type to accept late payments gracefully. But the most damaging evidence came when Davidson discovered Ashworth's encrypted email account. Working with international cybersecurity experts, she was able to trace communications between Ashworth and contacts in foreign countries. The emails were coded, but the pattern was clear. Ashworth was providing classified information in exchange for regular payments. The foreign contacts weren't common criminals looking for palace gossip. They were sophisticated intelligence operatives who understood exactly what kind of information would be most valuable. They had been paying Ashworth handsomely for inside details about royal security, family plans, and government communications that passed through the palace. Davidson realized that Ashworth had been planning to frame James for weeks before the documents were actually planted. The spy had carefully studied the guards' schedules, their living arrangements, and their personal habits. James had been chosen as the perfect victim because he was honest, hard-working, and completely trusting of the people around him. The night camera malfunction made perfect sense now. Ashworth had the technical knowledge and administrative access needed to disable the security system temporarily. He had waited for a night when James was working a double shift, ensuring that the guard would be exhausted and less likely to notice someone entering his quarters. The documents found in James's room were copies that Ashworth had made specifically for the frame-up. The real stolen information had already been transmitted to his foreign contacts and deleted from palace systems. Ashworth had kept copies only long enough to plant them as evidence against James. Davidson discovered that Ashworth had been getting increasingly nervous about the investigation closing in on him. His foreign contacts had been pressuring him to provide more valuable information, but increased security measures were making it harder for him to access the most sensitive documents. He needed a scapegoat to throw investigators off his trail, and James was the perfect choice. The detective found evidence that Ashworth had been studying James for weeks before the frame-up. He had observed the guards' routines, learned about his quarters, and even tested his security access to make sure James would have theoretically been able to steal the documents he was accused of taking. What made Davidson angriest was how calculated and cold Ashworth's plan had been. He had destroyed the life of a completely innocent man without showing any sign of guilt or remorse. While James sat in jail facing years in prison, Ashworth continued to attend meetings with the king, participating in royal events and maintaining his facade of loyalty and trustworthiness. The evidence against Ashworth was overwhelming, but Davidson knew she had to be absolutely certain before making any accusations. A mistake at this level could end her career and potentially damage national security. She spent weeks double-checking every piece of evidence, verifying every digital trail, and building a case that no defense lawyer could challenge. The hardest part was keeping her investigation secret while Ashworth continued to work closely with the royal family. Every day that passed meant more opportunities for him to steal additional information or potentially destroy evidence of his crimes. But Davidson also knew that moving too quickly could alert him and give him a chance to escape or cover his tracks more thoroughly. When Davidson finally felt confident that her case was unshakable, she realized that she was about to uncover one of the most serious security breaches in modern royal history. The man who had been trusted with the king's most private communications, who had access to state secrets, and who sat in on confidential meetings about national security, had been selling that information to foreign powers for months. The betrayal was complete and devastating. Ashworth hadn't just stolen documents. He had violated every oath of loyalty and service that came with his position. He had put the royal family in danger, compromised national security, and destroyed the life of an innocent man to cover his own crimes. As Davidson prepared to present her findings to the authorities, she thought about James sitting in his cell, probably wondering if anyone would ever believe his claims of innocence. Soon, she hoped, he would be free and his name would be cleared. But first, she had to make sure that Lord Timothy Ashworth faced justice for one of the most serious betrayals in royal history. The evidence pointing to Lord Timothy Ashworth painted a picture so shocking that Detective Davidson had to read through it multiple times before she could fully believe what she had discovered. This wasn't just any palace employee. This was a man who had been King Charles's most trusted advisor for over 20 years. Ashworth had been present at some of the most intimate and important moments of the royal family's life. Davidson reviewed Ashworth's background and was disturbed by how perfect his credentials appeared on the surface. He had graduated from Oxford with honors, served briefly in the military, and joined the royal household at a young age. Over 2 decades, he had slowly worked his way up to become one of the most powerful people in the palace. The king relied on him for everything from scheduling important meetings to advising on sensitive political matters. What made Ashworth's betrayal even more shocking was how completely he had fooled everyone around him. His colleagues described him as intelligent, dedicated, and absolutely loyal to the crown. He worked long hours, rarely took vacations, and seemed to live and breathe royal protocol. No one had ever questioned his commitment or suspected that he might have divided loyalties. The financial investigation revealed the true scope of Ashworth's deception. His gambling addiction had started small, occasional bets on horse races and football matches. But over the years, it had grown into a serious problem that consumed more and more of his income. He had hidden his losses from his wife, his friends, and his employers, creating a web of lies that eventually became impossible to maintain. Davidson discovered that Ashworth owed money to several dangerous people who weren't patient about collecting their debts. The private lenders he had borrowed from charged extremely high interest rates and used intimidation tactics when payments were late. Ashworth had been living in fear for months, knowing that his financial situation was spiraling out of control. The IDM foreign intelligence contacts had approached Ashworth at exactly the right moment. They had somehow learned about his debts and offered him a solution that seemed too good to pass up. All he had to do was provide copies of certain documents, and his financial problems would disappear. At first, he probably told himself it was just harmless information that wouldn't really hurt anyone, but intelligence services don't work that way. Once they had Ashworth providing information, they had leverage over him. They could threaten to expose his spying unless he continued to cooperate. What had started as a desperate attempt to solve his debt problems had turned into a trap that he couldn't escape from. Davidson found evidence that Ashworth's handlers had gradually increased their demands. They started by asking for routine, correspondence, and scheduling information. Then they wanted security protocols and travel plans. Eventually, they were demanding access to the most sensitive communications between the royal family and government officials. The detective discovered that Ashworth had developed sophisticated methods for stealing and transmitting information. He would photograph documents with a hidden camera, copy files to encrypted storage devices, and even memorize sensitive information to write down later. He had access to almost everything that passed through the palace, and he had been systematically betraying that trust for months. What made Davidson angriest was how Ashworth had chosen James as his scapegoat. The spy had carefully studied all the palace guards, looking for someone who would make a believable suspect, but wouldn't have powerful friends to investigate on his behalf. James's honest nature and simple lifestyle made him perfect for framing, while his lack of influential connections meant that few people would question the evidence against him. Ashworth had spent weeks planning the frame-up. He had made copies of documents specifically to plant in James's room, timing the operation for a night when the guard would be working a double shift and too tired to notice an intruder. He had disabled the security camera with the technical skills he had learned during his years managing palace communication systems. The spy had even prepared alibis for himself, making sure he could prove he was somewhere else when the documents were planted. He had attended a dinner party that evening, staying late and making sure multiple people could testify to his whereabouts. It was a clever plan that showed how calculating and cold-blooded his betrayal really was. Davidson realized that Ashworth had been living a double life for so long that he had become expert at deception. He could sit in meetings with the king, discussing matters of national importance while secretly planning to sell that same information to foreign powers. He could express concern about palace security breaches while being the person responsible for those breaches. The psychological profile that emerged from Davidson's investigation was disturbing. Ashworth wasn't driven by ideology or political beliefs. He was motivated purely by self-interest and greed. He had betrayed his country, his king, and an innocent man simply to solve his personal financial problems. There was no higher purpose or noble cause behind his actions. What made the betrayal even more personal was how Ashworth had taken advantage of the king's trust and friendship. Charles had relied on him for advice during some of the most difficult periods of his life. When the king was struggling with the responsibilities of the crown, Ashworth had been there offering support and guidance. All the while, he was secretly documenting those private moments for his foreign contacts. Davidson found communications showing that Ashworth had provided his handlers with detailed information about the king's personal habits, family relationships, and private concerns. He had violated not just official secrets but the most intimate aspects of royal family life. The royal family's private conversations, personal struggles, and family dynamics had all been turned into intelligence reports for foreign governments. The spy had also put the royal family in physical danger by sharing security information. Travel routes, protection procedures, and vulnerability assessments had all been transmitted to his contacts. Any of this information could have been used to plan attacks or kidnapping attempts against members of the royal family. When Davidson examined the full scope of what Ashworth had stolen, she realized that the damage to national security was enormous. He had access to communications between the palace and government officials, intelligence briefings, diplomatic correspondence, and strategic planning documents. The information he had provided could have compromised ongoing operations and endangered the lives of intelligence officers working overseas. The detective also discovered that Ashworth had been planning his escape strategy. He had been slowly moving money to overseas accounts and had recently applied for passports under false identities. If the investigation had taken much longer, he might have disappeared entirely, leaving James to face the consequences of crimes he had never committed. As Davidson prepared to confront Ashworth with the evidence, she felt a mixture of satisfaction and disgust. She was glad to have uncovered the truth and proven James's innocence, but she was horrified by the depth of Ashworth's betrayal. This man had destroyed lives, endangered national security, and violated the most sacred trusts of his position, all for money to feed his gambling addiction. The confrontation would be dangerous because Ashworth was intelligent and resourceful. He might try to destroy evidence, flee the country, or even attempt to harm the people who had discovered his crimes. Davidson knew she would have to move quickly and carefully to ensure that justice was served and that no one else was hurt by this man's desperate attempts to avoid the consequences of his actions. Detective Davidson's hands were trembling slightly as she walked through the corridors of Buckingham Palace toward the king's private study. She carried with her a folder that contained evidence of one of the most devastating betrayals in royal history. The weight of what she was about to reveal felt almost unbearable, knowing how completely it would shatter the king's trust in someone he had considered not just an employee, but a friend. King Charles was reviewing state papers when Davidson was announced. He looked up with the polite but somewhat distant expression he usually wore when meeting with investigators. He expected this to be a routine update about the James Whitmore case, perhaps news that the prosecution was moving forward smoothly. He had no idea that his entire understanding of the situation was about to be turned upside down. Your Majesty, I need to inform you of some extremely serious developments in the investigation, Davidson began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. The evidence shows that James Whitmore is completely innocent of all charges. He was deliberately framed by the real criminal. Charles felt a flicker of confusion cross his face. I'm sorry, Detective, but the evidence against Whitmore seemed quite clear. The documents were found in his possession. How could he possibly be innocent? Davidson took a deep breath before continuing. Sir, the real spy has been operating inside the palace for months. The person who stole those documents and planted them in Whitmore's room is someone with much higher access than any guard could ever have. Someone who has been systematically betraying royal secrets to foreign intelligence services. The king's expression shifted from confusion to concern. Who are you talking about, Detective? Who has this level of access? Your Majesty, the evidence points conclusively to Lord Timothy Ashworth. The words hit Charles like a physical blow. For a moment, he couldn't process what he had just heard. Timothy Ashworth, the man who had been by his side for over 20 years, who knew his most private thoughts, who had helped him navigate the most difficult periods of his life. It was impossible. It had to be a mistake. That's absolutely ridiculous, Charles said, his voice rising with indignation. Timothy has served this family faithfully for decades. He was with me through my mother's death, my coronation, every major crisis we've faced. You must be mistaken." Davidson had expected this reaction, but she had to press forward. She opened her folder and began placing evidence on the king's desk. Bank records, encrypted communications, digital forensics reports, and photographs of Ashworth meeting with known foreign operatives. "I understand how difficult this is to believe, Your Majesty, but the evidence is overwhelming. Lord Ashworth has been selling royal secrets for months to cover gambling debts. He has provided foreign intelligence services with information about your personal activities, family communications, security procedures, and state correspondence." Charles stared at the documents spread across his desk, but his mind was struggling to accept what they represented. "Timothy doesn't gamble," he said weakly. "He's never shown any interest in betting or casinos. You must have the wrong person." "Sir, he has been hiding his addiction for years. The debts were substantial, and when he couldn't pay them, foreign agents offered him a way out. All he had to do was provide copies of documents that passed through his office." As Davidson explained the details of Ashworth's betrayal, Charles felt his world collapsing around him. This was the man who had organized his coronation, who had sat with him during state dinners, who had access to every aspect of royal life. Every private conversation, every family decision, every moment of vulnerability had potentially been documented and sold to enemies of the crown. "The documents found in James Whitmore's room?" Charles asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Planted there by Lord Ashworth on a night when he knew the security camera would be disabled. He chose Whitmore as a scapegoat because the guard was honest, hard-working, and had no powerful friends who might investigate too deeply." Charles thought about all the times he had dismissed his advisor's suggestions to investigate further before prosecuting Whitmore. His certainty that the evidence was clear. His determination to show strong leadership by refusing to show mercy. He had been completely wrong, and his rush to judgment had nearly destroyed an innocent man's life. "How long has this been going on?" the king asked, dreading the answer. "Based on the evidence, at least 8 months. Possibly longer. Lord Ashworth has had access to some of your most sensitive communications during that entire period." The implications began to sink in. 8 months of private conversations, family discussions, government briefings, and personal correspondence that had been systematically betrayed. Charles thought about all the times he had shared his doubts, fears, and private thoughts with Ashworth, believing he was talking to a trusted friend. Instead, he had been providing intelligence to foreign governments. "The security implications are severe, Your Majesty," Davidson continued gently. "Information about your travel plans, protection procedures, and family activities has been compromised. We're working with intelligence services to assess the full extent of the damage." Charles stood up and walked to the window, his legs feeling unsteady. 20 years of friendship and trust had been a complete lie. Every moment of genuine connection he thought he had shared with Ashworth had been false. The man had been studying him, documenting his weaknesses, and selling his secrets while maintaining a perfect facade of loyalty. "I trusted him completely," Charles said, his voice breaking slightly. "He knew things about this family that no one else knew. Private struggles, personal fears, family conflicts. I shared everything with him because I thought he was someone I could rely on." Davidson felt genuine sympathy for the king's pain, but she had to continue with the briefing. "There's more. Your Majesty, Lord Ashworth was planning to flee the country. He has been moving money to overseas accounts and has obtained false travel documents. If we hadn't uncovered this when we did, he might have disappeared entirely." The thought that Ashworth had been planning to abandon ship made Charles feel even more betrayed. The man hadn't just stolen from the crown. He had been preparing to escape and leave others to deal with the consequences of his crimes. James Whitmore would have spent years in prison for crimes he didn't commit, while the real criminal lived comfortably in exile. "What about James Whitmore?" Charles asked, suddenly feeling overwhelmed with guilt about the innocent man he had been so eager to prosecute. "He's still in custody, sir, but we're preparing for his immediate release. All charges will be dropped and his name will be completely cleared. However, given the public attention this case has received, we'll need to carefully manage how this information is released." Charles closed his eyes and thought about how confidently he had declared that Whitmore deserved no mercy. how certain he had been that the evidence was clear and justice needed to be swift. He had been completely wrong about everything, and his mistakes had nearly ruined an innocent man's life while allowing a real traitor to continue operating. "I need to speak with James Whitmore personally," Charles said firmly. "I owe him an apology that can never truly make up for what I put him through." "That can be arranged, Your Majesty. But first we need to coordinate Lord Ashworth's arrest. He's currently in the palace, and we can't risk him learning about our investigation and attempting to flee or destroy evidence." As the reality of the situation fully hit him, Charles felt a combination of anger, betrayal, and deep personal shame. He had failed in his most basic responsibility as king, to protect the crown and the people who served it faithfully. Instead, he had nearly destroyed a loyal servant while being completely fooled by a traitor who had been operating right under his nose. The man he had trusted more than almost anyone else in the world had been his enemy all along. And Charles couldn't help but wonder what other mistakes in judgment he might have made. If he could be so completely wrong about someone so close to him, how could he trust his ability to lead the country and protect the monarchy? The arrest of Lord Timothy Ashworth happened so quickly that most palace staff didn't understand what was occurring until it was over. One moment he was attending a routine meeting about upcoming royal events, and the next moment armed officers were escorting him out of the building in handcuffs. The shock on his face as he realized his crimes had been discovered was almost satisfying to Detective Davidson, who had worked so hard to uncover the truth. King Charles watched from his study window as the man who had betrayed his trust for over 20 years was led away. He felt a mixture of anger, sadness, and relief. The anger was for the betrayal itself, the systematic theft of royal secrets, and the cruel framing of an innocent man. The sadness was for the loss of what he had believed was a genuine friendship. The relief was knowing that the truth had finally come out and justice would be served. But Charles knew that the hardest part was still ahead of him. He had to face James Whitmore and somehow apologize for nearly destroying the life of a man whose only crime had been loyalty to the crown. The king had never felt more humbled or more aware of his own fallibility. The drive to the detention center felt like the longest journey of Charles's life. He had insisted on going personally, despite his security team's concerns and his advisor's suggestions that a formal letter might be more appropriate. Charles knew that a letter would never be enough. Some mistakes required looking someone in the eye and accepting responsibility for the harm you had caused. James was brought to a small meeting room, still wearing the prison clothes that had become his uniform over the past weeks. When he saw King Charles enter the room, his confusion was obvious. He had been told that new evidence had cleared him of all charges, but no one had explained that the king himself was coming to see him. "James," the king began, his voice heavy with emotion, "I owe you an apology that I know can never be adequate for what you've endured because of my mistakes." James stood respectfully, still not fully understanding what was happening. "Your Majesty, I don't understand. They told me I was being released, but no one explained why." Charles gestured for James to sit, then took the chair across from him. "You were framed by someone I trusted completely. Lord Timothy Ashworth has been stealing royal secrets for months, and when he feared discovery, he planted evidence in your quarters to make you look guilty." The words hit James like a physical blow. "Lord Ashworth, but he's been so kind to me over the years. He always spoke respectfully to the guards, never treated us like we were beneath him." "That's what makes his betrayal so devastating," Charles replied. "He fooled all of us, James. But that doesn't excuse my behavior. I was so eager to show strong leadership that I rushed to judgment. I declared you guilty without proper investigation, and I was prepared to see you spend years in prison for crimes you never committed." James sat quietly for a moment, processing everything he was hearing. The man he had served faithfully for 15 years was apologizing to him personally. The betrayal by Lord Ashworth was shocking, but somehow less surprising than finding himself in this surreal situation. "Your Majesty, I won't pretend that being arrested wasn't the worst experience of my life," James said carefully. "Being accused of betraying the crown felt like my entire world was ending. But I also understand that the evidence against me looked convincing. You had to make decisions based on what you knew at the time." Charles was struck by James's grace and dignity even in this moment. A lesser man might have been bitter, angry, or demanding compensation. Instead, James was showing the same loyalty and respect that had characterized his 15 years of service. "James, I want you to know that you will be fully reinstated with complete honors," the king said. "All charges are being dropped, and your service record will reflect that you were falsely accused. You'll also receive full back pay for the time you've been detained, and any assistance you need to rebuild your life." "I appreciate that, Your Majesty," James replied. "But what I really want is to return to my duties. Being a royal guard isn't just my job. It's who I am. If you'll have me back, I'd like to continue serving the crown." Charles felt a surge of respect and amazement. After everything James had been through, his first priority was returning to service. This was the kind of loyalty and dedication that the monarchy needed, and Charles had almost thrown it away because of his poor judgment and hasty decisions. "Of course you can return," Charles said. "But I have to ask, after what you've been through, are you sure you want to? No one would blame you if you decided to pursue other opportunities." James thought for a moment before answering. "Your Majesty, Lord Ashworth's betrayal doesn't change how I feel about the crown or my oath of service. If anything, it reminds me why loyalty and integrity matter so much. Someone needs to stand guard, and I'd be honored to continue doing that job." The conversation continued for another hour, with Charles learning more about James's background, his family, and his genuine commitment to royal service. The king realized that in 15 years, he had never really gotten to know this man who had been protecting his family with such dedication. It was a reminder of how isolated his position could make him, and how easy it was to take good people for granted. When Charles returned to the palace, he faced the difficult task of explaining the situation to his family and the public. The media attention would be intense, and there would be serious questions about palace security and how such a massive betrayal could have gone undetected for so long. But Charles was determined to handle the situation with complete honesty and transparency. He personally wrote a statement taking full responsibility for the wrongful accusation of James Whitmore and explaining how Lord Ashworth's betrayal had been uncovered. He didn't try to minimize his own mistakes or shift blame to others. The public response was surprising. Many people were shocked by Lord Ashworth's betrayal, but they were also impressed by King Charles's willingness to admit his mistakes and personally apologize to James. The image of the king visiting a detention center to apologize face to face to a wrongly accused guard resonated with people who appreciated genuine humility from their leaders. James's return to the palace was an emotional moment for everyone who worked there. His fellow guards welcomed him back with genuine joy and relief. The other staff members who had always respected him felt vindicated in their belief in his character. Even the palace cat seemed happy to see him back at his usual post. The security reforms that followed were extensive and necessary. New procedures were put in place to prevent any single person from having such broad access to classified information. Background checks were strengthened, and psychological evaluations were added to the screening process for high-level positions. Lord Ashworth's trial became one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in recent British history. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his guilty plea spared the royal family from having to testify about the private information he had stolen. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison for treason, espionage, and conspiracy. For King Charles, the entire experience became a defining moment of his reign. He had learned hard lessons about the importance of thorough investigation over quick judgment, the value of humility in leadership, and the danger of blind trust even in longtime advisors. Most importantly, he had gained a deeper appreciation for the loyalty and service of people like James Whitmore, whose integrity remained unshaken even in the face of false accusations. James returned to his duties with the same dedication he had always shown, but now with the additional respect that came from having his character tested under the worst possible circumstances. His fellow guards looked up to him even more, knowing that he had faced the ultimate challenge to his honor and emerged with his integrity intact. The incident ultimately strengthened both the monarchy and the bonds between the royal family and the people who served them faithfully. It was a reminder that trust must be earned continuously, that appearances can be deceiving, and that sometimes the greatest threats come from within. But it was also proof that truth has a way of emerging, justice can prevail, and good people can survive even the worst injustices when someone is willing to keep searching for the truth.